It was a cold, foggy evening when Jenna, an introverted college student, decided to stay in for the night. The rest of her roommates had gone out to a party, and she was looking forward to some peace and quiet. Alone in her dimly lit apartment, she curled up on the couch with a book. The only sound was the faint hum of her refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Outside, the wind howled, pushing the fog closer to the windows. She heard it then, a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Must be the neighbors, Jenna thought, but when she opened it, no one was there. Only the cold, damp air of the hallway greeted her. Shaking it off, she closed the door and went back to her book, trying to push the feeling of unease that had suddenly settled over her. But the silence was too heavy now. The sense of something, or someone, lurking just beyond the door gnawed at her. Minutes later, the knock came again. 3 precise raps, just like before. This time, Jenna hesitated. She peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. Her heart raced, her mind torn between curiosity and caution. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. But again, there was no one there. Only the empty hallway, shrouded in the thick fog. Confused and unnerved, Jenna stepped out onto the porch, looking both ways down the dark corridor. Nothing. Not a single sound. The world felt as if it had paused, holding its breath. The chill in the air made her shiver as she stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. The silence returned, but it was different now, unnatural, as if the house itself was holding something back. Jenna tried to shake off the feeling, but then came the sound, a faint scratching like fingernails dragging against wood. She froze, her blood running cold. It was coming from behind the walls. Terrified, she grabbed her phone, dialing 911. The operator answered, her voice calm but stern. "What is your emergency?" Jenna stammered, trying to explain the strange noises, but just as she was about to mention the knocks, the scratching grew louder. It sounded as though something or someone was moving behind the walls, getting closer. She could hear it shifting, dragging itself in the dark. "Are you there?" the operator asked, her voice now laced with urgency. "Stay on the line, we're sending someone over." Jenna barely heard her. The scratching had escalated into a pounding, as though fists were slamming against the walls from inside. Panic surged through her veins. She backed away from the walls, eyes darting around the apartment, looking for anything that could explain the horrific sounds. But there was nothing but the relentless, deafening thuds. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The room went pitch black for a moment. When they came back on, Jenna screamed in terror. Standing in front of her at the foot of the hallway was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its face obscured by a dark hood. The air in the room grew impossibly cold. Without thinking, she ran for the door, throwing it open and running into the fog-choked night. But the figure followed. Every step, every breath was just behind her. The sound of its footsteps was deafening as it closed in until it was right at her back. Jenna stumbled, tripping over her feet, and when she looked up, the figure was gone. She stood alone in the middle of the street, breath ragged, eyes scanning the fog, but there was nothing. No shadow, no presence, just the cold, empty street. Heart pounding, Jenna made her way back to the apartment building, trembling with every step. She reached the door, but before she could turn the handle, it swung open by itself. Inside, her apartment was dark, eerily silent. No signs of a struggle, no clues as to what had just happened. The walls were as still as ever, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound that remained. Jenna stepped inside, her phone still gripped in her hand, heart racing. The knocking started again. 3 knocks, but this time she knew it wasn't someone outside. The figure was already there, waiting.
Story number 2.
It was an ordinary Saturday night when Carl, a young man living alone, decided to stay in and relax after a long week of work. His apartment was in an old, forgotten part of the city, a place that had seen better days. The walls were thin and the lights flickered occasionally, but Carl didn't mind. He found the isolation comforting. That night, he settled into his couch, watching a random movie and sipping on a beer. Outside, the wind howled, but he felt safe inside. Around midnight, a knock came at his door. It was a quick, sharp knock. 3 taps, then silence. He glanced at the clock, confused. It was far too late for anyone to be visiting. Hesitant, Carl went to the door and peered through the peephole. He saw nothing but the dark hallway. No one was there. With a shrug, he figured it was just a mistake and returned to the couch. But then the knock came again. 3 sharp taps. This time, Carl's heart skipped a beat. He approached the door cautiously, his mind racing. As he opened it slightly, expecting to find someone standing there, nothing but the emptiness of the hallway greeted him. The air was strangely cold, making the hairs on his neck stand up. He closed the door, convinced that his mind was playing tricks on him. But before he could even sit down, the knocking came once more. 3 rapid taps. Carl's nerves were frayed. He took a deep breath, deciding to check the hallway more thoroughly. He opened the door and stepped into the darkness, but still no one was there. The building was eerily silent now, as if time itself had frozen. But as Carl was about to turn back inside, he heard something else, a low guttural whisper. It was coming from the shadows. "Help me. Let me in." Carl froze. The voice was soft but unmistakable, filled with desperation and something darker. It sounded so close, but when he turned to look, no one was around. His pulse quickened and panic began to seep in. He slammed the door shut, bolting it with shaking hands. He tried to push the incident from his mind and went back to the couch. But the moment he sat down, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. He jumped to his feet, his heart racing, and rushed to the window. From the reflection of the streetlights on the glass, he could see something move outside. It wasn't a person, at least not entirely. The shape was too wrong, too twisted. Carl's stomach churned as he turned toward the door. He could hear faint scratching sounds now, like nails dragging across the wood. He crept toward it, his breath shallow, and pressed his ear to the door. The scraping continued, followed by a muffled voice, one that sounded unmistakably human, but distorted like it was coming from the other side of the door. "I can't breathe." In a panic, Carl grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling so badly that he nearly dropped it. The operator answered quickly. 911, what is your emergency?" Carl barely managed to speak, his voice breaking as he told the operator about the strange sounds and the whispers. Before the operator could respond, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. Total darkness consumed the room. Then came the knocking. It was no longer soft. It was violent, like someone was hammering at the door with a relentless fury. Carl's breath hitched as he heard a low voice, clear now, just inches from his ear. "Let me in, or I'll never leave." He turned to look behind him. Standing at the foot of the hallway, illuminated by the faint glow of his phone screen, was a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, his body distorted in unnatural ways. His face was a grotesque mask of anguish, his mouth stretched into a terrifying grin. Carl screamed and ran toward the door, desperately trying to unlock it. But the figure was already there, its hands slithering out from the shadows, grabbing hold of Carl's wrist. Cold, clammy fingers tightened around him, and the grip felt like death itself. "I've been waiting for so long." Carl yanked his arm free and bolted out of the apartment, running down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he neared the stairs, he froze. The hallway was no longer empty. Hundreds of figures, all twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, filled the space. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and they all turned to look at him at once, mouths opening in unison, all whispering the same thing, "Let us in." Carl couldn't move, couldn't breathe. They were closing in on him, surrounding him, until the darkness consumed him entirely. The next morning, the building manager found the apartment door wide open. Carl's phone was lying on the floor, still on the line with 911, but there was no trace of Carl anywhere. Just a whisper on the wind, "Let me in."
Story number 3.
It had been a long week for Clara, a young woman in her late 20s who had recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. The house had been on the market for a while, but she didn't mind. It was cheap, and she was drawn to its eerie charm. The house had a history, she knew, rumors that had once belonged to a family who mysteriously vanished. But Clara didn't believe in ghosts or curses, so she put it out of her mind. One evening, after unpacking for what felt like the 100th time, Clara decided to take a relaxing bath. The house was quiet, too quiet. The old pipes creaked and groaned, but she thought little of it. After all, it was an old house. She filled the tub with warm water, letting the steam rise around her as she sank in, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had lingered ever since she'd moved in. Just as she closed her eyes to relax, she heard something. A faint, low sound, almost like a whisper. At first, she thought it was just the sound of the water or the old pipes again, but then it came again. A whisper, clear and sharp. "Clara." Her body tensed. The bathroom was dark except for the dim glow from a single candle. She opened her eyes, but no one was there. Her breath quickened as she tried to calm herself. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, trying to dismiss the fear. But the whisper came again, louder this time, closer. "Clara, get out." Cold sweat ran down her back. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding, and hurried to get out of the tub. As she did, the water in the tub suddenly turned ice cold, sending a shock through her body. It felt as if the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and Clara's breath became visible in the air. She grabbed a towel and wrapped herself up, glancing nervously around the bathroom. The candle flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Something wasn't right. She was sure she had heard something, or someone in the room with her. Then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, thin, and its face was obscured by a dark hood. Its hands were long and bony, and it slowly raised one finger to its lips, signaling for silence. Clara's heart stopped. She couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her throat tightened. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, Clara saw its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The figure began to speak, but its voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural hiss. "You shouldn't have come here." Clara's body surged with adrenaline. She ran for the door, but the figure was too fast. In one swift motion, it blocked her path, its long, skeletal hand grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip. She screamed, struggling to break free, but its hold was unyielding. "Leave," it hissed, its voice chilling her to the bone. Before it's too late. Desperation surged within Clara, and with all her strength, she pushed the figure aside and bolted out of the bathroom. She slammed the door behind her and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The house was silent once more, eerily so, but the fear still lingered. She rushed downstairs and grabbed her phone, dialing her best friend Sarah, hoping to calm herself. As she waited for Sarah to pick up, she heard something else, a creaking sound coming from upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking in the dark hallways of the house. "Clara," Sarah finally answered, her voice groggy. "What's wrong?" Clara's voice shook as she spoke. "Something's in the house with me, Sarah. Something. I don't know what it is, but I can't stay here anymore." Before Sarah could respond, the creaking grew louder, closer. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She turned to look at the stairs, and there, at the top of the staircase, stood the figure again. This time, it wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, pale, shadowy figures, all standing at the top of the stairs, staring at her with hollow, empty eyes. Clara's blood ran cold as she saw their mouths open wide in unison, their voices coming together in a chorus of whispers. "Leave, now." Terrified, Clara ran for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. Panic set in as she turned back toward the stairs. The figures were descending, moving toward her with unnatural speed. She could hear them getting closer, their ragged breaths filling the house. The walls seemed to close in on her, and every door was locked. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were all around her, their cold hands reaching out, pulling her into the darkness. The next morning, the house was silent once more. Clara's car was still in the driveway, but no sign of her could be found. The neighbors would later say they saw a shadowy figure standing in the upstairs window, watching the world with cold, lifeless eyes. And the house? It remained on the market, as it always had, waiting for the next person to come. But those who had lived there before Clara, none of them ever left.